Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Rona Munro's play Scuttlers. So Munro is actually one of my favorite playwrights. I haven't read anything by her in a while and sort of forgotten how much I enjoy her work, but Scuttlers I really, really like. This is a history play, which many of you who are longtime viewers, if such a creature exists, will know I really enjoy. I'm a big, big fan of history plays. But one of the things that's interesting is, while it's a history play, it doesn't necessarily feel like a history play. Part of that is because it revolves around these very modern themes, particularly the issue of gang violence. So this is a play set in 1888 in the city of Manchester in northern England, which was one of the first industrial cities, along with places like Glasgow and Belfast. And along with the issues of poverty, of alcoholism, of workers being disabled by machinery, of slums and tenements and all this stuff, all of these urban problems, you also had the development of street gangs. And so this play revolves around the Tigers, the Bengal Street Tigers, hence the t-shirt. So the Bengal Street Tigers are one street gang, and their primary rivals are the Prussia Street Gang from across the bridge. And we have these conflicts between the two gangs as they vie for territory, but also within the gangs themselves as various members of the gangs regularly challenge the leadership for dominance. So this is very much a world built on violence and built on being the toughest person. At the same time, this is an industrial city in which people are working these extremely difficult and dangerous jobs. And so you have this element. At one point in the stage directions, Munro actually describes the people going to work and coming back from work as like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, which, if you've ever seen that film, there are these famous shots of people just sort of robotically walking toward work or away from work, and they are totally dehumanized. And so we have that element here as well. But one of the big thematic concerns of the play is actually about family and friends. Because early in the play, we have Teresa, who, she's not the leader of the Tigers, because Sean is the leader of the Tigers, but Teresa seems to be a sort of autonomous figure within the Tigers gang. She doesn't necessarily take orders from Sean. She can advise him, but not necessarily command him. But she also protects a few of the female Tigers, Margaret and Polly primarily. So Margaret has left and joined this street gang because her mother's boyfriend, I guess, or stepfather, it's not 100% clear, attempted to rape her, and her mother did not believe her. And so Margaret left home, joined this street gang, and the play actually opens more or less with the Tigers attacking him and beating him up. And then there's Polly, who is very, very young. She dresses as a boy, and she's extremely enthusiastic and dedicated to the gang. Um, so Teresa sort of protects them, takes care of them. They all stay in the same bed with her in this sort of very crowded room occupied by impoverished industrial workers. And Teresa says to Margaret, basically, she doesn't need to sort of defend her mother or sympathize with her mother, and she doesn't need to feel bad about what they did to this guy. In fairness, he attempted to rape her, so fuck that guy. But Teresa says, friends you choose. Friends choose you back. That's something you can lean on like a warm stone wall. That's something that can last beyond the grave. And so from very early in this play, we have introduced this idea that family is unreliable, but that friendship is a solid foundation. And the characters seem mostly to operate under this premise. But then we come to learn that it's actually much more complicated than this, and that Teresa's view is shaped by her own experiences with her mother, who died fairly horribly, it seems, from what Teresa says. Because she and this guy named Thomas, who is not a tiger, but who has dedicated himself to becoming the king of Bengal Street, which basically means the leader of the Tigers gang. He has stolen a bottle of gin, and now Thomas and Teresa are drinking together. And they're talking about basically their family experiences. And Teresa... so Thomas asks what her mother died of, and Teresa says, I don't know, she was just sick. I tried to look after her. We'd no money for a doctor with her too sick to work. She pulled me to her, and her hands were that hot, and her breath smelled like a drain, but I loved her. I did. Face was that thin at the end, but I thought she was beautiful because I knew it was the last I'd see of her. I was holding onto her hot hands tight because I knew she was going. I was begging her not to up and die and leave me, but I knew she couldn't help it, really. You weren't stupid then. She was sick. But that was the last thing she said to me. Just hold on to your sisters. Now that were stupid, because how could I do that? She died saying a stupid thing like that, and it tore me to scraps. And we learn that Teresa's sisters have mostly died. One of them might be alive in a workhouse, but she doesn't know. Thomas, we learn that his mother had a series of boyfriends, husbands, not real clear. She had children from multiple men, and he does not know who his father was. But he has this sort of mythology of his father, that his father was the king of Bengal Street. He was the most feared scuttler, which is a street gang, or a term for a street gang member in this period. That he was the most feared scuttler in Manchester, and so Thomas has come to Manchester, has come to Bengal Street to try and recreate his father's legacy. Basically, in a way, in order to make his mother proud of him. Like, that's kind of the driving objective here. While that is going on, we have Joe, Susan, and George. George is the leader of the Prussia Street gang. Susan is his sister. Susan is a nurse, and she opposes George being in this gang at all. But George, it's not particularly easy to leave a street gang, and George is aware of that. Joe is the father of Susan's son, but he ran off to join the military. Now he's returned as a soldier, and he's going to try and keep George out of trouble, keep him from having to actually fight the Tigers. That's the objective. The problem is that it kind of doesn't work out, really. Like, what Joe's plan is essentially to stop the two gangs from fighting is that the Prussia Street gang will show up with their massive numbers, twice the number of the Tigers, and they will simply sort of intimidate the Tigers. They will show that they cannot be defeated because of their numbers, and the Tigers will back off, George's leadership will be secured, and nobody will have to fight, nobody will have to get hurt. What they don't account for is Thomas. Thomas is desperate to be remembered, desperate to have a name that people know. And so at this sort of showdown between the two gangs, Thomas, who had stolen a knife from a dude that the Tigers had been harassing earlier, Sean tells the Tigers basically to back away, facing toward the Prussia Street gang so that they clearly weren't running, but to back away from the fight. Thomas starts out forward and ends up going after George and Joe by himself, basically, and he stabs both of them. Now, this is the sort of culmination, right, of the logic of this kind of gang fighting, territorial fighting. Everybody seems totally just shocked by this stabbing because much of the fighting is more sort of low-key fighting, fists, clubs, things like that. Like, people are not dying in these fights for the most part. And so when Thomas just stabs George and Joe, it's a shock to everybody. But then the Tigers are charged, the gang battle starts, etc., etc. And so the problem is when you develop a plan based on people acting rationally, based on, say, the Tigers looking at the numbers the Prussia Street gang has and saying they outnumber us 2-1, we can't fight them. That plan depends on people to act rationally. And if they act irrationally, then bad things happen. And so both George and Joe are brought to the dispensary where Susan works. So she now has her brother and her former boyfriend, father of her child, whom she actually still seems to love or at least have affection for, even though she's angry at him. She now has both of them dying without a doctor there. And so she and Margaret, who had come in earlier, Margaret had come in because of an earache, and Margaret actually becomes sort of interested in potentially becoming a nurse because she likes keeping things clean. She likes doing the kind of work that's involved in nursing. And so Susan sort of conscripts Margaret to help her try and save these two men's lives. Joe ends up dying. George, as far as we know, survives. He seems to still be okay toward the end. But we had learned slightly earlier, and I don't remember if I mentioned this or not, but we learned that Teresa is actually Joe's sister. So Joe had initially abandoned Teresa and their younger sisters in a move rather mirroring his abandonment of Susan and the baby he didn't know about. Like, the baby was born after he left, and presumably because he didn't know about it at all until much later, presumably he didn't even know that she was pregnant when he left. But Teresa sort of asks to sit with Joe's body, and Teresa and Susan initially rejects this until Teresa says that he was her brother. And then they have that thing that they can sort of bond over, even though Susan is from Prussia Street and Teresa is from Bengal Street. But the other thing that I think really is interesting here is that there's this strange moment of almost unaccountable beauty in this industrial city. This just, I would say this fairly terrible existence these people are living. Margaret, as I had said, goes into the dispensary because she has an earache. And Susan pulls something out of her ear. And it's a butterfly. A blue butterfly. And somehow it had crawled into Margaret's ear and died. And it is this strangely beautiful moment. I don't know what to make of it. But in the midst of this grimy, dirty, industrial city, there's suddenly this strange blue butterfly in a place where it logically shouldn't be.